the city. There's a few famous paintings of this. But the only really rich description of it is from handed down in the ancient world is the book of Nahum. If you haven't read the book of Nahum, probably read it in about 5 minutes. It's a very, very short book about the destruction of Nineveh. Then, 3 years later, in 609 BC, since we're BC, the dates get shorter. Megiddo. Megiddo is a city in the Esdraelon plain, north of Israel here, which occupies a very important pass between the mountains. In fact, the only way to travel south to north in Israel is through the Esdraelon plain guarded by the city of Megiddo. There's a big mountain next to it. And so, because it was so strategic, it was the site of many famous battles. The Hebrew, Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, is where we get the word Armageddon. Har Megiddo, Armageddon. And so that crystallized in ancient literature as the site of bloodshed and battle. There's no accident that later biblical writers spoke of Armageddon as the final great battle between good and evil. And in 609, Josiah, who since Assyria had been on the ropes, had been leading a religious revival in Judah, actually finds himself in a precarious political situation. He's afraid Assyria's on the ropes. Egypt is going to attack Assyria at the city of Megiddo, and he supports the Assyrians. He tries to prevent the Assyrians from invading because he's afraid that Egypt wants to take over Judah as well. And he's not wrong about that. Josiah dies in that battle in 609. At that point, all of the religious revival in Judah stops. The kingdom is taken over by his less than worthy son. Judah is now a vassal of the land of Egypt, which means they have to pay annual tribute. They have to supply the army with soldiers. And this begins the very difficult part of Jeremiah's ministry. Jeremiah, at this point, enters the most difficult period in his life. His own family tries to have him assassinated. He goes into silence for a while. He's the only one preaching the things that he's preaching, and his famous laments come out of this prayer that God would come down and kill him and let him die. Very, very uplifting Bible passages. I haven't yet found a way to put it in the liturgy, but we'll try it. There's passages of the Bible where you're looking at them like, how is this ever going to fit into public reading of Scripture? They're very, very difficult passages. However, Jeremiah delivers a famous sermon in the temple at that time called his temple sermon, which Ezekiel most certainly would have heard of. And I mentioned last week, Ezekiel was almost certainly influenced by Jeremiah. And then finally, page 14, and this is where we pick up today in 598. Nebuchadnezzar invades Israel from Babylon. I should say Judah. Northern Israel has ceased to exist for over 100 years. Judah becomes a vassal of the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar sets a puppet king on the throne. Maybe you guys know what a puppet king is. It's a ruler of a country who's not really in charge. Maybe just like an old fool who doesn't really know what's going on or even where he's at particularly. No, but you sense somewhere in the background somebody's running things. Anyways, so Zedekiah becomes a sort of puppet king. Judah's under tribute, and it's just a matter of time. Nebuchadnezzar seizes a considerable amount of plunder and deports all the most important men out of the country. That's important because for Nebuchadnezzar, you leave intelligent and capable men in the country, they could rebel. They have a sense of their independence. They might raise an army. They might rebel. What you need to do is you need to leave the country in the charge of young, unintelligent, and capable people. In that way, you can control it. And in that, Ezekiel is taken, 598. He's married by this time, apparently. If he was born in the time that we said that he was, he would be just on the cusp of becoming a priest. He never gets to fulfill that career, and he goes into exile. So on page 14, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit, what was life like in exile? If you got taken into Babylon as an exile, what was that like? What was Ezekiel up against? And so how, when he wrote what he wrote, what was the background of that? So that's where I'm beginning on page 14. So the first section here, 597 to 593, covers about 4 years before he gets his vision. So Ezekiel's in exile for about 4 years before he receives his calling as a prophet. And we're going to talk about the conditions of that. But before I jump into that, let me see if there's any questions.
Sorry, Chad, I missed that. There was a section in Scripture you said was difficult to put in the liturgy. What was that again?
I was talking about the laments of Jeremiah.
You're not thinking of doing that to me.
No. Much of the liturgy we follow between Christmas and Pentecost is from the Anglican tradition. You also find it in the Lutheran, and it even goes back to the Roman Catholic and Orthodox tradition. When we hit Trinity Sunday, we're going to begin a series on Paul. And at that point, I will produce the liturgy myself. Every Trinity season, produce a kind of liturgy and a series of readings that will be specific to whatever we're studying at the time. But at least for half of the year, we follow the life of Jesus, and there the liturgy is traditional. But the point is that in some of the Psalms and the prophets, there are passages they're very difficult passages, where Jeremiah expresses doubt. He expresses that he wants to die. The Psalms express those things too, and pastors and churchmen have always found it difficult to know how to incorporate that into public worship. Maybe is the point. But you read those passages in the Bible. The Bible's not a book for little kids. Even though it has some kiddie parts to it, it deals with real issues, that grown people dealt with, life and death issues. And they often struggled with doubt and difficulty. So I think those are good passages of Scripture. I don't think I know how to put them in a liturgy, though. 597 to 593 on page 14. Nebuchadnezzar was not as brutal as everybody thought he'd be. Took a lot of money, deported the important men to Babylon, but he allowed the city to continue, and he put it under the rule of Mattaniah, who was renamed Zedekiah. This passage from 2 Kings chapter 24. Jehoiakim gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mother and his servants, and all his officials and palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and all the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of Yahweh, which Solomon king of Israel had made, as Yahweh had foretold. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So that's what's going on in Judah when Ezekiel was taken into exile. I got a couple footnotes here. Daniel is said to have been taken into exile earlier than this event, if you read the book of Daniel. We have no record of that in Babylonian documents, so that's a matter of controversy. Though we do have records of this. How many people were taken out of Judah? How many were deported? 2 Kings gives 10,000 to 8,000, somewhere in that range, of the best men of Judah. Jeremiah gives a very precise figure of 3,023, though this has been also, who is he counting? Is he just counting adult males? Is he counting young men? Is he counting women and children? Who is he counting? It's not exactly clear. And we have no Babylonian figure for the records here. We do have Babylonian documents, and I put them in the footnotes when they intersect with the Bible at different times. This phrase, all the treasures of the house of Yahweh, Jeremiah makes it clear that not all were taken, and anytime the Bible says all, we have to take that with a pinch of salt. If you've ever read the book of Joshua, you run up against that. All the land was taken. And then the next verse says something like, the Lord said there's yet more land to be taken. I thought you just said all. So the word all is taken with a pinch of salt. Probably means something like a lot, most. The Ark of the Covenant is not mentioned here. And this is one of the, for all you raiders of the lost Ark, this is one of those passages that are part of the question of what happened to this most sacred object in Israel's history. When was it taken and what happened to it? Now, now the movie with Harrison Ford has the thesis that it was taken much earlier than this when Pharaoh Shishak invaded Judah. They had another verse that says the same thing. He took the possessions of the house of the Lord, in which case it would end up in Egypt. And if you've seen the movie, you know that Indiana Jones and Salah are in Egypt when they find the Ark of the Covenant. However, the last mention of it is in the reign of Josiah. So I'm sorry to tell you that Raiders of the Lost Ark is probably not accurate. Josiah had the ark in his reign, and that would have been during the lifetime of Ezekiel. The ark was still in Jerusalem. The present passage makes it likely that Nebuchadnezzar took it. An earlier passage in Chronicles indicates the ark was not always housed in the temple. The King's passage fails to mention it specifically, so we don't have a specific reference to it being taken. Later rabbis passed along a rumor that it was hidden in a secret chamber beneath the Temple Mount, probably the cave now known as the Well of the Souls, which is in the Temple Mount, now covered over by a Muslim mosque. In which case it would have remained hidden for at least 10 more years until Nebuchadnezzar took the city. The book of 2 Maccabees picks up on this idea and says that Jeremiah took the ark east of the Jordan River and buried it in a secret place on Mount Nebo, presumably close to where Moses was buried, long, long time ago, back in the book of Deuteronomy. Long story short, nobody knows where the Ark of the Covenant is, except that it's in a warehouse where the CIA put it at the end of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Babylonian Chronicle contains an account of this invasion of Nebuchadnezzar in 597. I'll read it here. In the 7th year, the month of Kislev, king of Babylon assembled his army, and after he had invaded the land of Hatti, he laid siege, to the city of Judah. On the 2nd day of the month, he conquered the city and took King Jeconiah prisoner. He installed in his place a king of his own choice, and after he had received rich tribute, he sent, top of page 15, forth to Babylon. So that's nice. These later events, when we read about them in the Bible, there's often parallel accounts in Babylonian literature. And this is something that enables historians to date specific events and check the testimony of the Bible against material outside the Bible. Zedekiah was 21 when he became king. He reigned 11 years, and then Jerusalem will be taken. He was an appointee of Nebuchadnezzar, so his position was suspect. His exiled nephew, Jehoiakim, was still regarded as the rightful king. And we'll find that Ezekiel dates all of his prophecies with reference to the year of Jehoiakim. So for Ezekiel, at least, Jehoiakim is the true king. He uses him as a way of dating his prophecies. So if I open up my Bible and I turn to the book of Ezekiel, just in the first chapter, and I read verse 2. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. What we have here is somewhere between 4 and 5 years. Ezekiel dates every prophecy he receives according to the reign of what he regards as the true king, Jehoiakim. Now, Jehoiakim's not king in Jerusalem. He's been taken in chains to Babylon. Zedekiah is the king in Jerusalem, but Ezekiel still regards Jehoiakim as the rightful king. And so he uses his reign in order to date his oracles, and he's the only prophet who dates his oracles in this way. We'll have to talk a little bit about why that is. He gives the day, the month, and the year. You don't find that in Isaiah. You don't find that in Jeremiah or any of the other prophets. And so I have to talk a little bit about why he is so precise. Zedekiah is not a very good ruler. He's got a lot of people in Judah pulling him in different directions. Nebuchadnezzar returns every year to the Holy Land, every year in the springtime, from 597 to 594, each year returning home with huge amounts of men and money. And then after that, the record breaks off. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the Jewish diaspora at this point. And diaspora is a word that means dispersion. The Jews are now in Egypt. Some of them are in Babylon. Some of them are in the Holy Land. And so we think of the word dispersion. They've been dispersed over the earth. And that's where the word diaspora comes from. Now let me stop a moment and see if there's any questions or if I've left anybody in the dust here talking about this event. You've got the time, the place, the approximate number of people, what was taken. We don't know if the Ark of the Covenant was taken. Probably it was. And Ezekiel along with it. When the Babylonians took the Jews into exile, they settled them in various parts of Mesopotamia. One part was called Tel Aviv. Now, that's different than modern Tel Aviv. but that's where Ezekiel was at with his fellow Jews. We learned that there's a canal there called the Kebar Canal. And many of you know that in Mesopotamia, with these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, they had been building canals for a long time to rechannel the water for agricultural purposes all throughout the land. Today, all this is called Iraq, modern state of Iraq. The Kebar Canal is near the city of Nippur. Nippur is a very, very ancient city in Mesopotamia. It's one of the oldest cities in existence. It goes back as far as 5000 BC. The Sumerian deity Enlil, who is the head of the pantheon, had a temple in Nippur, which would have been a ziggurat with a temple at the top of it. And there was also, Nippur was the chief center of learning. So there's a lot of literature and writing that went on there. I mentioned here in a footnote nearly 30,000 Sumerian and Akkadian documents on clay tablets have been discovered at Nippur. For people who study Mesopotamian literature, that's about 80% of all of the literature discovered in Mesopotamia comes from that city. That's significant, as it shows that Ezekiel was moved within the vicinity of a place that was highly educated, highly literate. They didn't put him in some ghetto with a bunch of unlearned people. They put him in an area where there was a lot of prestige and learning. Life in exile was not as harsh as we might suppose. The exiles were allowed to make families, they could build homes, they could hold jobs, and they stayed in contact with their fellow Jews back home. That'll be important. We read Jeremiah. Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles and has it delivered and read publicly to them while they're in Babylon. That shows that Jerusalem and the exiles are communicating back and forth. Jeremiah actually traveled to Babylon on several occasions. And Ezekiel would have heard news about what was going on back in Jerusalem, in his hometown. And so Nebuchadnezzar did permit the Jews to live in communities where there were homes, jobs, opportunities for advancement and communication back and forth. That did create problems for him because they also had what today in America we'd call right to assembly. They would get together and have religious meetings. And that was in many ways the beginning of the synagogue. Prior to this event, the synagogue did not exist. Everybody worshiped at the temple, or they shouldn't have, but they worshiped at other places outside the temple. But they would have performed sacrifices and sang hymns and done things like that. But now in exile, we begin to have in houses and small communities people gathering to do what? To read, to pray, to sing psalms and hymns together. In some ways, that's the beginning also of the church. Everything that we do here on a regular basis comes out of synagogue worship. We read the scriptures, we recite the psalms, we sing hymns, and we study in a Sunday school class. So church life and synagogue life very, very close to each other. So I got a little footnote about that. Top of page 16, a little bit about some of the rebellions that occur in these meetings. The Jews living in Babylon, not Nippur where Ezekiel was, but in Babylon, did engage in rebellion. In 595, we know that a large number of Jews were stirred to disorderly conduct by wild promises of their prophets. Prophets had come to town and say, Yahweh's going to do something. He's going to send us all, we're going to all be back home next week. It's all going to happen. Everybody get all stirred up. The Babylonian Chronicle says the rebellion was so big that they needed an armed force to suppress it. So the Jews are creating trouble while they're in exile. Several of the prophets whose utterances lay at the root of the trouble, Nebuchadnezzar had them put to death, just had them executed. So prophets who are stirring people up get executed. We even know the names of a few of them: Ahab ben Kolaiah and Zedekiah ben Maaseiah. And like Daniel and his friends, they were roasted in the fire. That passage from Jeremiah. So Daniel is not the only book that indicates that Nebuchadnezzar had an affinity for baking people in a large oven as a form of capital punishment. 594, the following year, more rumors of rebellion. People this time back in Judah had heard rumor that Babylon's getting ready to fall. Ambassadors from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, all of these areas around Judah, they all get together, they meet Zedekiah, and they say, okay, Babylon's getting ready to fall. Let's come up with a plan. This is our big chance. Zedekiah goes to Jeremiah and says, what do you think? Is it true? Jeremiah, true to form, says, everybody else is wrong but me. No. Babylon's not cracking, and you should not engage in this rebellion. That'll be important because Ezekiel has to do that too. Jeremiah back home and Ezekiel over here are both up against popular prophecies that are telling the people that things aren't so bad and that they're going to get better soon, and they're preaching what the people want to hear. They're preaching what the people want to hear. I will say, I taught Jeremiah a few years ago. Between Jeremiah and Ezekiel, there are more phrases, thus saith the Lord, in those two books than in any other part of the Old Testament I've ever read. And I think that has to do with this issue. They are up against a host of people who are saying, God says this, God says that, God says that over there. And so the people are caught, but it's prophet against prophet. The people are caught between a lot of people who claim to speak for God. They can't all be right. And so Jeremiah and Ezekiel particularly use what's called the prophetic formula, thus says the Lord. They get a lot of trouble for that. They get a lot of heat for that. But I think that comes out of this combative situation where so many people at the same time are claiming to speak for God and they're saying different things. You can understand that. I don't think that's far removed from our own time. Ordinary people ask, well, who do I listen to? No, who am I supposed to believe? Jeremiah does send a letter. I put a footnote on this. Chapter 29, verses 1 to 23. I always make fun of this letter because it always appears every year around senior graduation in life versus I know the plans I have for you, to prosper you. And there's always one or two high school kids who that's their life verse. It's a great verse. It comes out of Jeremiah, but basically what Jeremiah is saying is he's telling the people in Babylon to get comfortable, and they're going to be there for a while. Jeremiah's letter is, there's not going to be any second Exodus. Babylon's not going to crack and fall overnight. You might as well find a house and a family, get a job, settle in. You're going to be there a while. And that's what the letter of Jeremiah is about. And Ezekiel will be up against the same thing. As we'll see, the first 7 years of Ezekiel's ministry, there's certain things he's not allowed to say because nobody will ever believe them. He has to keep them to himself, and then only after Jerusalem falls is he actually permitted to say anything. So I got a few footnotes on that, but let me jump over to page 17. I wanted to spend about half the class doing what I just did there and talking about the exile and the conditions of the exile. And now on page 17, hey, 2.5 weeks. I'm actually into the book. We're into the text. So let me stop and see if there's any questions about all of that. Or comments or anything of interest. So when we get to those first verses of Ezekiel, a lot of waters passed under the bridge. We're in Babylon. It's the year 593. It's a very complex religious and political situation. And into this, these events happen. Yeah.
The Jeremiah 29 section there.
Yeah.
So overall, the gist of the whole passage is get comfortable, correct?
So the whole passage here, what'd you say?
The Jeremiah 29 passage, you just talked about.
Yeah.
1 through 23. The gist of it, the entire passage is get comfortable in Babylon, correct?
Yeah.
However, when you get to the famous part of it where people use that for all sorts of things, that is telling them that they have a future back in the homeland, correct?
That is correct. Jeremiah did say, he said it at 70 years, they would return home and that there was a future for Israel. But it wouldn't be in the time frame that the prophets that were getting everybody all excited about said that it was. So they would have to wait a long time. And I think a big part of that is many people thought Jerusalem would never fall. They would get home before Jerusalem fell. Jeremiah and Ezekiel believe that Jerusalem will fall, the land, and that means the temple. And for most ancient peoples, that is almost a faith breaker. They've got to deal with that. Yeah.
How do you, is there references that you recommend to, okay, so I go and I start studying and reading the Old Testament. All the players, I don't understand the players and the references and even the places. I mean, it's like you read a passage and it's like, it says, well, this place and that place and this place and that place, and it's like I get a feeling that those places are all real important, but I have no clue what they're, you know what I'm saying? I mean, is there references where you can go and kind of get the story of what you're teaching now, but
Yeah. How do you break into these books?
yeah, because I mean, it's kind of like, oh, and then talk to him and them.
Now, a generic Bible commentary can be good. Some Bible commentaries are very simple, and they're for lay people. And then there's others that are very scholarly. You sort of tell when a scholar is writing for other scholars. You kind of get through the first paragraph and you're like, whoa, okay. He's writing to his buddies at Harvard or something, because I didn't understand a word of that. But I would say, with the books of the prophets, yeah, if you get a standard study Bible, it won't go at too great depth, but it will at least help you understand the places. It might have some maps, some chronology, and that can help you into it. That's a good place to start. So I would start there. And part of the point of these lessons here that I teach is to do that and then maybe take it a little further. But you're right, that is frustrating. I would say growing up, very few people I met ever even read these books. Or more, maybe it would be more, they tried to read them and then they gave up because they were too tough. It was just that they're tough. Like you said, they mentioned people and places. All these things are happening, and this was 3,000 years ago, you know. We didn't live back then. When I first started studying the Bible, that was a surprise for me. I've made this joke before, but I was always told that the Bible was God's love letter to me. And I'm afraid I walk away with the idea that God doesn't know how to write a very good love letter. Well, that's a joke, but the point is that the book of Ezekiel was written to people of its own time. And it means that we have to go back and do a little bit of work to try to understand what's going on in it. It's a very, very ancient book.
Well, it's just like sitting through this class. Now, I'll go back and I'll read it, and it'll mean something.
Might mean something.
It's like, oh, that is going on.
And other parts of the Bible aren't that tough. You know, if we read certain parts of the Psalms or even parts of the Gospel or Paul's letters, we can almost wiggle our way into those texts with very little of this sort of historic prelude. But these Old Testament books, particularly the prophets, they're very, very old. And they're very, very different. So I like them, but it is definitely an acquired taste. So on page 17, Ezekiel's inaugural vision, this would take place in the summer of 593. He writes, in the 30th year, that's where we don't know the 30th year of what? Maybe his life. So when I was 30. It would be nice if the Hebrew text said, in my 30th year. In the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month. Now, 4th month. Okay. 5th day of the month. I was among the exiles. And by 4th month, you got to probably begin counting off from what today we would think of as March. Because in ancient calendars, the year begins in the spring. Now, that's preserved in our calendar names. So if I say October, November, December, Octa, Nova, Deca, that must mean 8, 9, 10. So our Western calendar, we've shifted the dates. We say December is the 12th month, but the word Deca means 10. We say November is the 11th month, but Nova means 9. And Octa, 8, Septa, 7. If you push it back, that means the year's going to begin in the springtime in March. Okay, so. In July and August, clearly months named after which Roman Caesars? Julius and his adoptive son, Augustus. And there it is. So the 5th day of the month, March, April, May, June, July, we're talking about mid-June, sometime in June. I was among the exiles by the Kebar Canal. The heavens opened, and I saw a divine vision. Now, this is interesting. He starts in the first person. But then if I'm looking at Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 3 shifts over to the third person. The word of Yahweh came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kebar Canal, and the hand of Yahweh was upon him there. So first verse says, I was doing this. And by the time we get to the third verse, it says, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. There, most scholars are going to detect the hand of a later editor. In other words, Ezekiel wrote a lot of what we have here, but he didn't write it all. And then other people later are going to talk about him in the third person. He appears to have been alone and gazing into the waters of the canal when the vision came. If, like Jeremiah, he had not been persuaded by spurious prophets that the exiles were getting ready to return home, I get the idea that Ezekiel was looking for a lonely place of solace away from his fellow Israelites. And we'll find there's a lot of that goes on in this book. He's a very solitary figure. He doesn't fit in well with his contemporaries. This statement, the hand of Yahweh was upon him there. What does that mean? In Jeremiah, that phrase occurs a number of times, and it refers to a condition of being oppressed by, you see if I can bring it down to an ordinary. Haven't you ever been in an environment at school or church, or maybe even in your own family, where you felt very alone in a room full of people because everybody was thinking this way and you are not? And so that is the sort of thing Jeremiah talks about in this passage. I have not sat in the company of revelers and made merry. I have sat alone because your hand is upon me. That's that phrase. The hand of Yahweh was upon him. And you have filled me with indignation. So Jeremiah uses this phrase, the hand of Yahweh was upon me, to describe how he experienced being angry at his own people and isolated in his anger because it made him feel very, very much alone. And Ezekiel uses this phrase too. However, he'll soon discover that the hand of Yahweh is also empowering, and it will enable him to stand alone for a position that no one else is taking. And that's very, very important for the prophet.
It says to give those dates again.
Yeah.
30th year in protocol, 5th day. And then the editor puts in that it was the 5th year. Doesn't the editor say it's, the 5th year of the exile of the king?
So the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, we can set that precisely as 593. What we don't, in whatever that year is also the 30th year of whatever Ezekiel's talking about. We just don't know what he's talking about. So we've got a little bit of a tennis match between Ezekiel and his editor. Ezekiel says it was the 30th year. And the editor says, and we know when that was. But he's not more specific. 30th year of Ezekiel's life. Strong case to be made for that. That's what I've done in this class. But I couldn't prove it. At least not to the satisfaction of all. Now, the next section, we get into this vision. Chapter 1, verse 4, if I'm reading from the ESV, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, a fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, a gleaming metal. So in that verse, there is a wind coming from the north, that carries some kind of radiant and incandescent cloud. Now, if we've all read our book of Exodus, this should immediately create a recollection of the cloud that leads the Israelites out of Egypt in the days of the Exodus. There's some sort of glow coming from within the cloud. There's a word here that we do not know how to translate, called hashmal. And there's these words that occur in Ezekiel. I was reading Jerome earlier, and Jerome was trying to translate Ezekiel into Latin. Jerome did not like this book. He liked it, but it was just very difficult to translate because it had a lot of words that he didn't know how to render into Latin. Hashmal, we don't know what that word means. My ESV translates it gleaming metal. Maybe. It refers to a bright substance with a color like fire. Whenever it occurs in Babylonian and Assyrian and Sumerian literature, we have some cognate words with it, it's connected with deities or divinity. So that much we know. So I've left it untranslated here. And then as the cloud approaches, we're given a view into what lies at the heart of it. So the cloud comes, at the center of it is this luminous thing for which Ezekiel uses a word that we don't know how to translate. And as he looks in it, he sees 4 living creatures, beneath which are wheels rimmed with eyes, above which is a crystal-like platform and a figure seated on a throne. And so this is undoubtedly the Hebrew word merkabah, or chariot. Each of the 4 creatures carries a platform on which is a throne, and next to them are wheels, and it's a chariot. It's a chariot that Yahweh would use to ride into battle. We've got a lot of art from the ancient Near East that depicts living creatures carrying chariots into battle. Gods and goddesses seated on thrones carried from below by animals, usually lions, griffins, or composite creatures with wings. Mixtures of different animals with wings, or probably what today we would call a sphinx. Body of a lion, wings, head of a human, perhaps. In the Eastern civilizations, they called a sphinx a cherub. The plural of cherub is cherubim. And so whenever in the Bible we read about the cherubim, we should probably not think of angels in the sense that we think of them with white robes and harps, or I guess I was at the DIA a few weeks ago, fat little babies. I don't know where they got those kinds of cherubs from. These cherubs are a little more formidable. Body typically of a lion, wings of an eagle, head of a human. These ones are a little bit different, but their job is to carry the chariot. Now, at the top of the chariot is a crystal kind of dais. That would be a platform on which you set a royal throne. But the word for that in this passage is rakiyah. And in ancient Hebrew, that refers to the sky. If you go outside these doors and you look up at the sky, it looks like a big dome. You feel like the earth you're in the middle of a big dome. And on top of that dome is the throne of Yahweh himself. Now, they don't have any conception of outer space, so we probably don't want to get too much cosmology out of this. But the idea is that they are carrying him who lives above or beyond the universe. So the four living creatures are identified as cherubim, and we find sort of examples of their appearance in other parts of the Bible. But I'll read some of these. We'll talk about them, and that's probably as far as we'll get today. Verse 5, from the midst of it came the likeness, and Ezekiel likes this word, the likeness of this, the likeness of that, the likeness of that over there. He never directly describes what he sees. He only says it was like. So that's very contemporary. He sounds like most of my high school kids. Well, it was like this, and I was like, and he was like. They're like, yeah. So, but I think Ezekiel's trying to make sure that we understand that what he saw is beyond anything that he describes. So he can say what it was like, but we probably shouldn't run to the presses and say, yes, Yahweh rides in a chariot driven by four animals. Ezekiel would say, well, that's what it was like. That's not exactly how it is. So he uses this to sort of distance the reader from what Yahweh is in himself and his vision of him. This was the appearance. They had a human likeness, but four faces, and each had four wings. Their legs were straight. The soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. They sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their four sides they had human hands. On the four sides had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The four had the face of a lion on the right side. The four had the face of an ox on the left. The four the face of an eagle, presumably on the back. There's been a lot of discussion about this, but they appear to have four different faces: front, right, left, back. Human, lion, ox, and eagle. Now, these four living creatures obviously reappear in the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation is going to talk about the four living creatures in the throne room. And in medieval paintings, they're often depicted as the four writers of the Gospels. So if you go to the DIA and you see these different animals. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had two wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while two covered their bodies. So they got four wings total, two on either side, which connect at the top, presumably hold up the dais upon which Yahweh's throne is set, and then two others which cover their bodies, presumably out of modesty, cover their private parts. Each went straight forward. And here, this verse, interesting. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. The Hebrew here is very, very difficult. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creature, one for each of the four of them. Okay, so there's wheels. The appearance of the wheels and their construction. Their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. The four had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of the four directions, without turning as they went. The rims were tall and awesome. The rims of all four were full of eyes all around. So all of the wheels are rimmed with eyes. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. When the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. When the Spirit wanted to go, they went. The wheels rose along with them, for the Spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And when those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. For the Spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Then over the heads was the expanse. Now that word expanse is the Hebrew word rakiyah, for the dome, the clear dome of the heavens. That song, Lord, you set your glory above the rakiyah, the heavens, shining like awe-inspiring crystal spread out above their heads, and under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another. Each creature had 2 wings covering its body. When they went, I heard the sound of their wings. This comes up in Revelation, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, the sound of a tumult, the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings. There came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. So the one seated on the throne above the dais speaks. So there is, in verse 26, the likeness of a throne. In appearance like sapphire, seated like the likeness of a throne, was a likeness with a human appearance. Upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire, enclosed all around. And downward, what had the appearance of his waist, I saw were the appearance of fire. And there was brightness all around, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of a rain. So there's the rainbow. So those of you who have read the book of Revelation, does it lean heavily on this vision from Ezekiel? Very, very much it does. He says, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So the voice is going to speak. I haven't got a whole lot of time today to discuss the particulars of the vision, but this is the most elaborate vision in the Old Testament of Yahweh in any of the books of the prophets. And so it receives a whole lot of attention. Must stop and see if there's any kind of comment, because we'll probably chat about it a bit and then we'll have to leave it. Yeah.
The use of mixing human parts and animal parts is common in ancient cultures.
Yes.
And it goes way back. So everybody was kind of doing that. So there had to be some sort of intent in mixing human parts and animal parts. And was that to make something more formidable or to set it apart in some way? Where were they going with using this type of?
No, that's a good question. Certainly animals were viewed as having a spirit or representing a certain power. And if we look at these animal parts here, of domestic creatures, the ox is considered the most powerful. Within ancient literature, if you want to represent strength, a bull or an ox represents strength. The lion, even today, continues to be the king of the jungle, representing nobility. The eagle is thought of as the swiftest or the fastest or the most agile of creatures. And of course, mankind himself represented the rational or the most noble of living things. So at the very least with this, you're right, this, you see it in ancient art, this drawing on animal imagery. And I think that's part of a rich culture of metaphor, where the vision of certain animals particularly conveys certain ideas. Strength, swiftness, nobility, reason. In other words, the highest elements of God's creation. And yet, significantly here, they're servants. They're not to be worshipped. But they're the highest things that we know of down here on earth. So that's conveyed in that imagery. And I think that's probably a big part of it. Yes, and the one on the throne is beyond description. But we do have a conception of strength and nobility and agility and mastery or reason. But here in Ezekiel's vision, I think it's intentional. The highest things that we know of are below. And the one who is above is, you'll see that Ezekiel's very careful not to give too precise a description of the one on the throne. Well, what we'll do is, let me say a few things about this lesson, because we'll pick up with this vision next week. Because the one on the throne is going to speak. And he's going to call Ezekiel to his mission. I want to talk a little bit about the Spirit and the Rakiyah, and I have a few, this work in this lesson, I have a few areas of translation that depart from our ESV. And talk a little bit about those words as they come up. And what we think is going on with this vision. So that'll be where we pick up next week. But for today, to kind of cover what life in exile was like and the time and the place where Ezekiel has his inaugural vision is a good place to stop. And if you want to take this home and look at it, you can. You'll see in the italics, I put question marks and comments all throughout when I encounter things in the Hebrew text I don't quite know what to do with. There was a very good one I encountered this last week. I'm enjoying going through this. I'll try to make it as enjoyable for you. I find the Hebrew word, it reappears in the Psalms. The Hebrew word refers specifically to the feeling that a mother has for an infant that is still in her womb. We have no English word for this. So I would translate it with about a hyphens. The feeling that a mother has for an infant who still lies in her womb. Now, most English translations render it compassion. What's that? Well, compassion, it's kind of in the ballpark, but you can kind of get the idea when you go from one culture to another culture, they have words for specific things that are very precise. And we don't always have words in the language for them. It's a kind of suffering. But anyways, it enriches the text. It gives a richness to the text. So when I encounter words of that sort, I'll bring them out and we might talk about them. Because these translations that we use here, these are good translations. They're not bad translations. But there is that phrase they say, lost in translation. Things do get lost in translation. So I'll leave it at that and we'll go see what we got to eat downstairs.